Welcome to our webinar on Directors' Duties on Public Sector Boards. Over the course of the next hour or so, we will hear from Brendan Linehan and from panel members Aidan Horan and Aoife Moran on the important role played by professional accountants on public sector boards. And we will explore some key matters to consider when deciding to join a public sector board. And finally, we'll hear from Niamh McGuinness in Public Jobs, and Niamh will speak a little around the appointments process for state boards. I'll introduce each of the speakers a bit more as we move through the webinar. But first, I want to start by introducing Pamela McCready, current President of Chartered Accountants Ireland.
Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to join your session today on Directors' Duties on the Public Sector Boards. This is one of my first engagements from taking the chain of office in Belfast for President, and it's an absolute pleasure to be with you here today. The central theme and priority for my year as President is the implementation of our Strategy 27. There's a number of things that we seek to focus on: attracting our talent and our next generation, upholding trust in the profession, building a relevant and future-focused support for our members, being a strong and effective voice, and helping members navigate change. Strategy 27 is a timely blueprint. We're operating in a complex world with rising costs, geopolitical pressures, and technological accelerations. And the trusted role of the Chartered Accountant is more important than ever. And I very much look forward to the working with members in the implementation of this. Today's topic is just one of the ways that accountants are called upon as trusted leaders. The theme of the event is the need for qualified accountants to sit on public sector boards. Boards and committees of public sector entities and accounting knowledge and experience is important skills and is to be reflected in the composition. Professional accountants working in the public sector may, at some stage in their career, decide to apply to join a state board or agency. Often, professional accountants that have not previously worked or served in the public sector are indeed called upon to serve as directors on these boards. The public sector needs interested and able people to serve, and indeed our members want to give back. It's in society's interest that accountants serve, and they can add a lot of value to the great resource for a board. The skills of the Chartered Accountant are really invaluable and can bring a wealth of experience to those boards. Existing and prospective directors should be aware of their responsibilities and indeed the risks involved, and the unique character of those boards of organisations established in the public sector. Our speakers today will talk about these risks, professional and personal, such as conflicts of interest and legal implications around managing these. While we want to ensure that members are aware of their risks and responsibilities involved, we also want to empower people to take on these roles and guide them as to how they might contribute. Our speakers today is Brendan Linehan, Managing Director of Navigo Consulting, Management Consultant and Mediator, Aoife Moran, Partner in Public Sector Law at Mason Hayes and Curran, and Aidan Horan, Governance Expert and former Director with the Institute of Public Administration. My thanks to our chair today, Justin McCarthy, Head of Internal Audit at UCD and Chairman of Chartered Accountants Ireland Public Sector Committee. So thank you all for your time, and to all those attending today. Enjoy the event, and thank you.
Thanks very much, Pamela, for that introduction. So I'd now like to introduce our presenter today. As Pamela mentioned, Brendan Linehan is Managing Director of Navigo Consulting and a former President of Chartered Accountants Ireland. He's amassed significant experience as an advisor and consultant and as a non-executive director among many public sector boards, including the HSE, Unpost and Bosairan, in addition to his considerable experience in the private sector and as a partner in a global accountancy firm. So without further ado, over to you, Brendan.
Thanks, Justin, and thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm going to share a few slides with you, not an enormous number, but certainly enough to illustrate how we're going to get through the 20 minutes. Yesterday I went on stateboards.ie and I counted 199 bodies that are listed under 20 areas of government. That will be the subject really of what we speak about today. That excludes, I guess, university governing bodies, voluntary hospital boards, school boards, local enterprise office evaluation committees and all of the like, all of which I know chartered accountants serve on. But in the light of recent cases like Children's Health Ireland, RTE in Ireland, the post office scandal in the UK and others, it's timely, I think, to look critically and a practical level at directors' duty on public sector boards. And thanks to Chartered Accountants Ireland and Justin and your committee for serving or for giving me the opportunity to do that. Hopefully these slides will work. Yeah, as Justin illustrated, I've served in various governance boards, governance roles on these state boards. Cumulatively, I've had a decade of experience as ARC chair, the Audit and Risk Committee chair at Bus Air and HSE, and on PUST. In others, I've served on committees as an external member or an interim role. So it's fair to say I've been around a bit. And if you think that's promiscuous, I guess there's a large number here of clients I've worked with in Navigo. I mean, of those 199 bodies, of the 199 bodies, but 70% of them actually are in 7 distinct areas in the public sector. So health, transport, arts, housing, justice, education, and food and agriculture account for about 1/3 of the government areas, but about 70% of the roles. And as I looked at my experience in Navigo, it's pretty much reflective of those areas. And for those clients, we've been providing board effectiveness evaluations, governance, consulting, and training and induction services generally. There are some good and not so good reasons to onboard into public sector roles. I mean, on the good side, it's an understanding public service and government, which has 25% of the economy. But many professionals only really have a rudimentary understanding of how government really works. It's a fabulous learning opportunity at scale. And to be frank about it, they're not making any new PLC boards currently. So it's an opportunity to work with some really interesting companies. It's interesting, it's challenging, it gives back your skills, your time, your talents, and you can contribute to making a difference. It's not maybe as powerful as you might think it is when you get in there, but if you understand the system, you can make a serious contribution. When I was appointed to the board of Bus Air in my first state role, many colleagues thought, honestly, I needed my head examined. For many of them, they thought it as dull as dishwater. But for me, it was an organisation that had a turnover of 600 million euro, 3,000 employees, and it, in addition to everything else, got 140 children to school in the morning and back safely in the evening. It was a phenomenal learning opportunity for me, and I must say I haven't looked back since. On the other side, there are some not so good reasons for joining a board. You want to appear on a Oireachtas TV, that's not such a great reason for joining. If you have Doge fever and you want to just radically reform Ireland Inc., that's probably not a great reason either. I've learned over the years, and I chair, by the way, a 100 million euro private company as well, so I can compare and contrast it. Private companies should be run like commercial private companies. Charities should be run like charities. Governments and government agencies need to be run like government agencies, not like private companies. The experiment in the US will be interesting over time to see if I'm right or wrong about that. If you think you're going to get the power to change everything all at once, this is probably not for you. You're part of an ecosystem I'll go into in a minute. If you're looking for praise and acclaim, you've probably come to the wrong place. Or you think, well, it surely couldn't take that much time. You're definitely in the wrong place. And I have to say, the board fees, don't do it for the money. Board fees have stayed the same since 2010, despite inflation going up about 30%. You'll be paid probably somewhere, I reckon, between 15 and maybe generously 30% of the rate you might earn as an INED in a private company setting. And the public appointment system, I'm sure, will argue that there's still a flow of people offering themselves, but unless you're retired or semi-retired, it can subsidise your time with income from elsewhere. There's probably not a very diverse cohort of applicants will come into these roles. Don't do it for the money, but I hope it doesn't, the attitude on fees doesn't reflect on the importance of governance. It's leaving cert season, so the first thing I normally do is try to locate myself in the universe here And it's a really good starting point when we're thinking about governance in the public sector, because governance is about a network of relationships, about who sets objectives and then steers towards them. And you can play a prominent role in that, but it's only part of the system. This is an illustrative but simplified map of the overall system you're going to be working in. You'll be a member of a collective on a board. And of course, you're going to be working with management and staff. And that's the entity when we come to the fiduciary duties. But that's not all of the map by any manner or means. You will probably work with intermediary bodies and funded agencies to actually deliver your services. HSE had tons of these. Even Bus Éireann has contractors. There's lots and lots between you and the citizens sometimes. There's another level, I guess, beyond that, where you're having to deal with what I call the system, the executive system of government. So there'll likely be a state licenser or regulator. In An Post, there was Central Bank of Ireland, and Comreg, Bus Éireann, NTA, in HSE, HICWA, the Mental Health Commission. You will also have to deal with your auditor, and in terms of normal auditing, you'll have the Office of the CNAG, who will apply standards of regularity and propriety, which are interesting ideas, which you'll have to learn. And then you'll have to deal likely with a minister and a department or multiple departments. In each of the commissions I've held, I guess we've dealt with two departments. In Bus Éireann, for example, deals with transport and education because of its role in the school bus system. It's a bit like Charles and Di in their relationship. There's always going to be more people in that relationship. There's always going to be, certainly in the south of Ireland, what it used to be Deeper and Deepender, now the Department of Public Expenditure. And they play a really important role in terms of new staff positions, rates of pay, approval of all sort of significant business plans. And then if you're a commercial state body, the NTMA operate a corporate finance outfit and a really good unit called New Era, which has a huge input on both appointments and strategies. There's a bonus level, I guess, over and above any private company, and that is public and democratic accountability. The minister is part of the cabinet. The cabinet is accountable to the Oireachtas. You have to deal as a company with the media and Europe and international organizations. And ultimately, a citizen with any decent phone connection can end up getting a question through a PQ or through the Oireachtas back into the company. It's the strength of the system, but it obviously does introduce risks. Objectives and policies and resources flow down this page, and outcomes and accountability flows up this page. So you don't get total power by having a letter pointing you to a board, but you do have access, I guess, to a system that allows you to set some objectives and deliver on others. Okay, so what then is the role of the board that's set out in the Code of Practice for the Governance of State Bodies? This is a lot of what Navigo does. We help people understand what leadership, oversight and compliance and the other role of the board actually is. It's tricky. The most difficult part of this obviously is oversight of how items that are delegated to management are actually delivered. The role of the board really is as a decision factory on that frontline part of that map. Obviously, there are leadership decisions, budget strategies to be approved. Are we complying? But the most difficult piece is the oversight. Are we making progress in objectives? And if we aren't, what's management's plan to get back on plan? And lack of oversight is probably the biggest problem in state boards. Who are accused often of being asleep at the wheel because they don't know the material used in spinal surgeries, what clinics are operated by doctors, what progress is being made on that systems implementation, what talent is being paid what are the prospects and risks for any particular show, for example. It's really difficult. And where I'm going to show you the opposite of what can happen over time if you don't do that job properly, you will end up here in a position where you almost end up as a palace board where you've given up oversight and you have the chief executive, or like the prime minister in this instance in the context of UK governance, who makes an occasional or even periodic visit to the monarch. And it's interesting, the role of the monarch in this situation, quite clearly in the UK Constitution, is to be consulted, to be supportive, and to warn. But formally, the monarch has no role in oversight. And that is critical here, because many state boards sandwiched between rising expectation, a feeling of disempowerment because the system makes a lot of the key decisions, a lack of time, and maybe a CEO in a chair, that fear erosion of empowerment, often take a step back on oversight. That is not the role of the board as set out in the code. Now, there is, of course, a cynical view here, and for completeness, I'm going to state it, even though I don't believe it, that the function of the board really is to act as a mudguard to protect the department, and in particular the minister, from any detritus that's flying around when things get really, really tough. So the role of the board is difficult in terms of frontline delivery, but really, really important as a decision factory. Let's move on to the director's fiduciary duties. While what the code sets out is the what of what you do: oversight, leadership, compliance. The fiduciary duties in the Act are of particular interest in public bodies because they deal with how you do it. The first and obvious one I'm going to pick out is to act in the best interest of the entity. And that often can come into conflict with the other fiduciary duty in the Act of having regard to the interest of the member. And I think from what I've said so far, you can see that there's a question about really the independence of entities when critical decisions in the public sector are often made elsewhere, at department level, at ministerial level, even down to approving staff roles, rates of pay, and access to services, which in a private company, the board of management just do with themselves, and maybe even the regulator occasionally, but you don't have that freedom in a public entity. Even those entities which have statutory independence in carrying out their functions don't always have independence in terms of the way they're staffed and funded. A really important question that arose in the courts in the past few years in Ireland, and this is a really interesting case, is where the minister can actually have formal power to direct or override the decisions of the board. That often happens in state companies. And this occurred in the case of Keating and Foynes Port, actually, in 2022, where the High Court ruled that directors breached their fiduciary duty because they followed what they thought the minister wanted, rather than the best interest of the entity. In fact, it was what the minister wanted. Pat Keating had a bonus arrangement with Foynes Port. The minister decided after the state code publication that it wasn't to be paid. The board agreed with the minister. Keating went to get his pay, and the board said, well, kind of nothing to do with us. The minister told us that this is what to do. And Keating sued. Keating, in fact, in the High Court won his bonus. And the High Court ruled, in fact, that it's the best interest of the entity is what the director should be focused on, rather than, even if the minister has the power to direct otherwise, they should sit down and write to the minister, setting out what the best interest of the entity is. But obviously, if there's a statutory power, the minister can exercise it. This isn't an everyday occurrence on state boards, but from my experience, it's not uncommon either. The issue of opening and closing services or running risks really red hot because it's electorally inconvenient for a minister to address is something to be concerned about and something to focus on in the context of the Foynes Port decision. And in the end of the day, it's the same as a private company. You've got to act in the best interest of the entity, not just simply look over your shoulder to see what the department and the minister want. Secondly, is to avoid conflicts of interest and not to restrict your independent judgment. State boards our recruitment is notoriously labelist. Sometimes the legislation will say we want one of this and we want one of that. And it seems like everybody has their jersey in the boardroom. And for some of you, a new experience might be sitting down with worker directors. But in my experience, that's been universally positive when I've worked with worker directors at Bus Éireann and in An Post, for example. As boards are increasingly challenged on culture, you have a real head start on the first obligation in that, which is understanding the views of the workforce. But it does throw up some interesting management in the boardroom that has to be done. If oversight is the weak point of state boards, then information flow is the key issue. And there's a real dichotomy here. Every quarter, for example, of all the years I served in the HSE arc, all of my emails to management were FOI'd by a press outlet. And FOI, freedom of information, makes documentation and communications often very opaque. And board discussions sometimes can be about not the substance of the point you raised, but whether you are actually correct to write it down or not. Against that, many communications functions exist in public bodies, and they've often impressive comms teams. And public and democratic accountability actually almost universally depends on information leaking out. So that's another dimension where you just have to be really careful about what you write down, how you communicate it. And board members are faced often with statutory confidentiality requirements, very strict ones, quite rightly. So the story is hard, if not impossible, to tell from your idea. And that's multiplied if the board perhaps has a different perspective than the management team. Then it gets really, really tricky in terms of information. Thirdly, I guess there's the real question about exercising care, skill, and diligence in your role. And it's really important to know that always, and this is true in private and public settings as well, there's a higher expectation of professionals who join boards as opposed to civilians. You have to bring in the knowledge of and experience you have into the boardroom. The public risk is usually less economic, more reputational, but state aid rules actually mean the government won't always immediately bail you out on things, and it's foolhardy to think otherwise. There's a real focus now on the board accessing external professional advice if it's outside the collective competency area of the board. And there's a real focus on that currently, which is important to know. But it's important to see yourself in a collective on the board. And if you can't deal with collective responsibility for major decisions, you should consider resigning. But that's usually in the context of major decisions. But there is a caveat there. And the case of the FRC and the RSA insurance company in Ireland says that professional regulation and accountability will follow you even if you resign. So it's really, really important that professionals, as opposed to civilians, if you don't mind me using that expression, understand what the duty of care is. We as accountants natively bring a huge amount. There's so much that a qualified, experienced accountant can bring, like these things. Natively, we bring internal controls and compliance, financial reporting, auditing, financial planning, and fraud, waste, and abuse are key political themes currently, and it's an issue that concerns government. Unfortunately, I have to say that as a profession, we've probably not won the battle in terms of convincing decision makers in the public system about the value of this. The public appointment system do a wonderful job bringing a list to senior civil servants and to cabinet ministers, but I don't always think that they value natively what we bring. In other words, the ability to do these things instinctively. The RTE report that Niamh Brennan did just, I think, about last year was really an interesting read. From 2020 to 2022, there was no qualified accountant on the board. The end of 22, the Audit and Risk Committee was made up, fine people now, of an engineer, a barrister, and 2 journalists. But they wouldn't qualify as having recent and relevant financial experience. There was an accountant appointed to the board in 2022, but who was appointed as chair, and that's a really, really busy role. It's not enough. There's not enough bandwidth in that role to do the things that a chartered accountant on a board can do. And it wasn't until the middle of 2024 until a qualified accountant was appointed as an ordinary member to chair the Audit and Risk Committee. And it's interesting when you look at the documentation, and it's in Niamh's report, what the system and RTE wanted at the time was somebody of, quote, broad commercial experience. And, as a keen observer of these matters, I'm not convinced things have changed much post-RTE. I see long vacancies, sometimes up to 18 months in filling financial vacancies on really critical state boards. I see ARCs which struggle to fulfill recent and relevant financial experience in their composition. As a profession, we haven't succeeded in communicating to the decision makers, not just the Public Appointment Service, the importance of professionally qualified accountants, because we bring all of these things, and this is the learning opportunity in this as well, a whole amount of other things. But when and you can extend those into lots of other skills you have. But I'll just give you two huge examples in the state code of gaps to summarize and conclude. Most bodies will have a commercial body will have a 5-year plan, which is required under the code. But much bigger non-commercial bodies don't require a 5-year financial plan, and therefore there's no basis to have a discussion for longer term financial planning with the line department. Similarly, on risk management, most bodies now have a decent risk management system, but obviously absolutely no docking station to have a sophisticated discussion with the line department, who will always tell you they want no surprises, but aren't really set up to have a discussion about uncertainty about the achievement of objectives, which is the core of risk management. Okay, to summarize, some advice on getting started and to prime this discussion. The first role really gets you started, and the cover letter to the public appointment system is key. Go through all the criteria and pull out in detail where your CV covers that. Don't spare them in terms of thinking that I'm just brilliant, come and get me. The world doesn't really work like that, because you do have to answer this question, why do you want to do this? But actually the bigger question is, what can you do for us? What can you do for this company? What can you do for the department and the minister and the board? Okay, understanding the relationships, that map of the world, the objectives, the department, the minister is really, really important, because it does vary depending on the area that you're in. The chair and the CEO approach to what they see the board doing and the dynamic varies by board. It's not always in line with the code. That dynamic will explain to you what is happening, and reach out to your network and ask them, is this a happy, productive place to be? In the end of the day, you want to do good work. You'll probably do good work in those environments. 360-degree intelligence at all levels. They will look at everything prior to your appointment, including your social media. And actually, even after that, I think there's a real gap, which I've asked the Institute to consider, about a professional network about accountants in public sector bodies. The Institute has lots of draws in its time. I'm interested to talk to any of you out there who would value a network like that. Be persistent and resilient. This is not something for the faint-hearted, but it's really, really rewarding. And to finalize my contribution, I just want to leave you with an adaptation of something John F. Kennedy said, and I'm not going to give you the twee, ask not what I can do for my country, but what my country can do for me, although I said it. It's actually another quote from him. He said, and I'll adapt it, choose to do it, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. It's hard. It's a learning opportunity. It's a fantastic way to understand more about your world in a really positive way. But don't underestimate how hard it is. So, Sinead, that's it. They're my contact details if you're ever looking at the slides. And thanks again for the opportunity to prime this discussion with some of my thoughts in this area, Justin. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Brendan, for that very comprehensive run through of directors' responsibilities. Brendan is staying with us for the panel discussion, and we're also now joined by Aidan Horan and Aoife Moran. Aidan is a Chartered Certified Accountant, a recognised subject matter expert in corporate and financial governance. Many of you might already know him from his role as a previous director with the IPA, where he still works as a senior associate. And he's accumulated vast experience as a director, an audit committee member, as a consultant, and as a contributor to many governance codes in the public sector. Aoife is a partner in the Professional Regulatory and Investigations team in Mason Hayes and Curran, where she advises public bodies on their public law and compliance obligations, including areas such as FOI, the conduct of investigations, and corporate governance. So she has a good insight into the challenges and to the evolving regulatory landscape faced by public bodies. Maybe to kick off and give Brendan a chance to catch his breath, might ask maybe Aidan and Aoife in turn, just if you have any initial responses or any key takeaways you took from Brendan's presentation. Maybe to you, Aidan, first.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much, Justin. Brendan, I understand the amount of work that would have gone into getting something done in 15 or 20 minutes, so congratulations on that. Look, couple of quick comments and remarks. And again, thank you so much for asking me to contribute. I mean, I'm going to start with Brendan's basic map. And at the top of his map and at the bottom of his map, he had citizens, customers, and service users. Yeah. Me, that is you. It's your family. Yeah. It's your parents, it's your siblings, it's your nieces, it's your nephews, it's your children, it's your grandchildren, it's your neighbors. Because ultimately, a public service body, a public duty entity is about doing something for society and giving something back. So I think I wouldn't underestimate the chance to make that contribution to those around you, your nearest and dearest, but wider society as well. So for me, that's really important. And commend the map, Brendan. It's hard to get it into a map, but top and bottom were citizens, customers, and service users. And we don't forget that. The other bit, I suppose, which is important for me, and again, go back on Pamela, the public service needs interest-enabled people. Professionals, accountants, and other professions can add huge value, yeah, to delivery of services and the nature of society and what we want to give to our people and the legacy we like to leave. So I think that's important. It's an opportunity to do a public duty, as I said, or a public service duty. But the personal piece, and I suppose this is about career paths and choices. I mean, this represents a significant learning and development opportunity. Why? Public service bodies, publicly funded entities, public interest entities, there's levels of complexity, there's levels of stakeholder engagement that you need to look at. There's a good chance for accountants. Do accountants have hard skills or soft skills, Justin? I don't know. Is it hard or soft skills? But if you have the hard skills, public service bodies are a good way to hone in your soft skills. Yeah, because you're going to have to deal and manage the soft skills sides. And I suppose the other bit for me and my experience over the years is you will benefit from being around the table with peers who have different insights and skills and knowledge, and you will learn from them. And I wouldn't underestimate the opportunity of the networks which being involved on boards and committees provide. And again, just to comment, you have boards, but you also have committees of boards who sometimes have co-options. And those co-options are a pathway to get onto boards as well. So don't underestimate that. But I do think, look, it's about giving something back. It's tremendously enriching and enlightening, but it is sometimes hard to do, to go with Brendan's final thing. It's hard to do, but nonetheless, I think you would get a lot more out than you put in. That has been my experience. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks very much, Aidan. And maybe the same question to you, Aoife.
Sure. And I suppose I maybe firstly, I fully endorse and agree with everything that Aidan and Brendan have said. A couple of additional points maybe from my own experience and having worked with public bodies, in particular pitfalls that we see arise quite frequently. And one of them is in relation to FOI, and I know Brendan has alluded to FOI already, and the second one is in relation to privilege, which is something that lawyers love to bang on about. So I think it's really important for boards to understand what privilege is, and in particular how it can be waived. So just very briefly, there's two types of privilege. There's legal advice privilege, so that's communications that are confidential, so the confidentiality piece is very important. And it's the communications for the purpose of giving, receiving, or seeking legal advice. And that could be the board seeking legal advice from their in-house counsel, if there is an in-house counsel function within the organisation. I know many of the larger entities have those, or it could be external legal counsel, and most public bodies would have external legal providers accessible for the board. And then you have your litigation privilege. So that's confidential communications as between clients, so the client being the board and the public body, counsel, external third parties for the dominant purpose of preparing for litigation, and that's also privileged. And a couple of points just arising from that. Privilege belongs to the client. So if you are sitting on the board, that is your privilege, and it is your privilege then to waive. So it's important that you understand how you might waive it and you don't do it inadvertently. So things that you might do where you would inadvertently waive privilege. We had a recent example where a public body had published on their website a document which referred to legal advice. And what happened was an FOI request came in, and the FOI request said, well, listen, you've referred to legal advice, haven't you waived that privilege over the legal advice? Can we have that? And that's currently, there's a dispute ongoing before the Information Commissioner as to whether that legal advice should now be released under FOI. And I suppose freedom of information, or FOI, which is a topic close to my own heart, if it's released under freedom of information, it's released to the world at large. So it will most likely appear in the public domain in some shape or form. I suppose the other point in relation to privilege, if you're sitting in board meetings, take care, and this is, I suppose, echoing a point that Brendan has made, take care that sensitive issues are being dealt with in the context of, if you've received legal advice on those issues, that you don't then in the board minute start to kind of summarize the advice or discuss it. Try and maybe just parse it to say legal advice considered and discussed. And if there's ancillary documentation, that you then just refer to the fact of the existence of that ancillary documentation. That's one way that, sometimes boards get caught out in terms of waiving privilege over material. And I suppose then and this kind of echoes the whole FOI and access to information on the environment point, which I'll very briefly talk to in a second, but just take care in terms of how you discuss and frame very sensitive issues, because I suppose the big difference between public practice and private practice is in public bodies and state bodies, transparency, is one of the key important factors. So anything that you write down, anything that you record will likely end up, or you have to at least assume that it may end up in the public domain. So just be really conscious of how you deal with sensitive issues and how you record them. And that just leads me on to my second point, which is in relation to information law. So I consider that to be freedom of information, access to information on the environment, and data protection. Data protection, everyone thinks, oh, Jesus, how am I going to get a data access request? Do I need to deal with that? Which, of course, public bodies do. But access to information on the environment is another area that is really coming into sharp focus. And a lot of commercial entities have kind of avoided the FOI Act in that they're excluded for good reason. Some of them aren't, unfortunately. RTE didn't manage they're partially excluded, but not fully. Access to information on the environment applies to all public authorities, so it's much wider. It will apply to commercial entities. If you're sitting on boards of commercial entities, commercial state boards, you need to be aware that it will apply to you. And we've had a spate of AIE requests. Now, it is specific to environmental information, but the definition of environmental information is very broad, and we've had a spate of AIE requests for board minutes. So again, just harping back to what is recorded at board minutes, just making sure that the documentation associated with board meetings is carefully examined with the lens of, well, this could end up in the public domain, it could end up in the front of the Irish Times tomorrow. So just if you look, I suppose, and carry out your role kind of through that lens, I think that's very important.
Thanks very much, Aoife. I should say as well, if anybody in the audience has any questions, please do pop them into the QA and we'll try and get to them. The first question I was going to throw out to the panel, and Brendan, maybe starting with you, you mentioned at the end of your presentation around the various entry routes into maybe getting a position on a state board. And I suppose maybe to expand on that a bit more, and actually ties in with a couple of the questions that have already come into us around what are the top prerequisites that you would expect to be in place before you consider taking a position? And I suppose the flip side is there anything that would make it not tenable for you to be a member of a state board?
Okay, my entry point originally, actually, funny enough, I got a call out of the blue to join the Audit and Risk Committee and CIE, because a lot of their Audit and Risk Committee members actually had either expired, or I think the last one died. And the minister at the time, Shane Ross, wasn't appointing any members to the board, and they didn't have anybody. So my name ended up getting suggested. So entry points onto these boards often are at committee work, which is really, really good. Take any opportunity, I think, that's offered to you, even if it's minimal pay. It's even less than what a director will get. The biggest prerequisite for me going on a state board is the quality of the chair. The chair, and whether they have an understanding and of where the board fits in and what they do, and whether they're a good chair or not, which can't be told from their CV, by the way. It's really about asking your network whether this person is a good chair or not. That's really the first central prerequisite. I see in one of the questions, are there red line issues? There are red line issues all over the place. If you can't buy into collective responsibility on serious issues, you should resign. And I did face that at one point. Some of you will know that I was unhappy at the time with the extent of disclosure of the what I absolutely knew in my heart of soul as a professional accountant would be a deficit for the HSE in 2023. But on the publication of the service plan, I was not happy with the way that was disclosed, and I resigned. And I think that was the proper professional course to take. The HSE made a deficit, I think, of 1.6 billion in that year, which is as much as it takes pretty much to run the Garda Síochána. But I couldn't, in professional good conscience, sign up to a business plan that suggested it wasn't certain it would make a very significant deficit. So, there are issues. It applies to private and public spheres. You have to be conscious of that and do the right thing for you at times, but at all other times, you're bound into collective responsibility and what's in the best interest of the entity. They're really, really uncommon, but sometimes they do occur. Don't know if that answered the question, Justin.
Yeah, it does. Thanks very much, Brendan. And maybe the same question to you, Aidan, around entry routes and also maybe the key prerequisites for joining.
Yeah. Okay, well, briefly, I mean, I think Brendan has talked about a bit of the due diligence you need to do here, before you're coming forward. First of all, has somebody reached out to you and invited you to come forward, or are you coming forward of your own volition, right? And the reason for that, sometimes you get asked to get involved. My experience, someone said, we have an issue or we have a problem. Yeah, we'd like some assistance and help. Maybe you might come from that position. I think looking at what the public information is available on entities, looking at what's out there, using the networks and contacts you have, doing your own due diligence, your own research on the roles. I do think meeting some of the key people, Brendan has mentioned the chair, looking at if there's a governance framework, what's the legislation state, what's their mandate, look at the annual reports. Stuff you will do. If you're going to do your due diligence, this is what you will do. But there's a point at which then you have to decide, okay, if I get offered, do I go forward? I would mention again, I mentioned and Brendan mentioned as well, sometimes you go straight to the board, but actually sometimes they co-opt onto committees. And I think the committees are a really good way and my experience with state boards that I'd be advising, sometimes people are co-opted on committees and they ultimately like to go onto the board. Others will just stay on the committee. They don't see themselves having a pathway to the board, and that's fine. But you're still giving and you're still investing back in the entity. So the due diligence, I wouldn't underestimate the importance of being comfortable. But you do get to a point of saying, I have to decide, will I or won't I? And sometimes you're going on to try to resolve a challenge they have. Yeah. And it might not be easy, but nonetheless, you're going to try to help and assist, whether it's on the state boards or if you go into non-profit boards or charitable boards. I mean, when we talk about public service, an awful lot of not-for-profit and charitable public interest boards are funded through the state, are obliged to adhere to the regulations that the state prescribes. So if you're on a charity board, or you're on a not-for-profit board and getting money from a department or from the HSE or whatever, you still have to be cognizant of that public duty component, the public audit and accountability requirements that go with service level agreements and so on. So we talk about state boards, but I suppose the IPA did some research a few years ago where we ended up having in excess of 600 types of entities here. If I add national school boards, there's over 3,000 national school boards. Where do we stop in terms of the amount of governing bodies and entities we could go on? I hope that helps, Justin.
Yeah, thanks, Aidan. And maybe, Aoife, you also on the entry points and the kind of key considerations to take into account.
Yeah, sure. And I suppose homework maybe, if you are, you're prepping yourself for either an interview or to sit on a board. I think understanding the role of the board that's already been said, but in terms of what the statute, so the governing legislation of the board of the public body says. So say for the Adoption Authority of the Adoption Acts, for RTE would be the Broadcasting Act. So really having a good understanding of that legislation and what your powers and functions are under it. A little tip, which maybe it's a little secret that I shouldn't be giving away, but sometimes if I'm trying to get a good overview or a quick overview of what legislation entails, all bills, the first time they go before the Oireachtas, will have an explanatory memorandum. I'm absolutely not saying that that should be the only thing that you look at, but it will always give you a very nice high-level overview of what legislation is proposing to do or what it's seeking to achieve. And then some more complex bills, the Oireachtas Library will have prepared a bill digest, and they're really good starting points if you're trying to get an idea of what legislation is about. And I suppose then the next point is to make sure that whatever functions the legislation sets out and prescribes to you, that you are fully aware of what they are. If they are delegated, that you should ensure, I suppose, that the board that you're sitting on or that you're proposing to sit on, that there's accountability back up to the board in respect of any of those functions that are delegated from the board downwards. So there's that that upward kind of accountability that Brendan spoke about earlier. And then I suppose just you have your own legislation, but then you have all the other governance legislation out there. So regulation of lobbying, ethics, official languages, equality, employment, protected disclosures. So just have a good overview of what those entail if you're thinking of, I suppose, dipping your toe in the water, or you're prepping or doing your homework for before you start your role.
The obvious entry point, Justin, obviously, is stateboards.ie, the public appointment service, and the advertisement of that, and someone in the chat mentioned it, that is by far and away the most, and I think the past do a really, really good job, but ultimately the decision makers in terms of who gets selected is with the minister and the senior civil servants. That's not PAS's job to select the person. So there's a really rich information resource there. And pick something you're interested in, you have an affinity in, you understand, you'll be excited by, or at least you don't think particularly dull. That's a really good entry point, and we should say that it's an obvious one. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Brendan. And we'll be joined by Niamh from Public Jobs a little bit later. Once you're on the board, I suppose, what are the kind of the key, and maybe staying with you, Brendan, on this, the key personal attributes a professional accountant can bring to the role, and thinking not just around the technical expertise, but I think Aidan mentioned the soft skills earlier, and just what are the key ones to have as a member of the board?
I mean, at a practical level, and I think this is what I kind of teach when we talk and do induction sessions. The board is a decision factory. Right? Whether the decision is budget strategies, whether it's are we making progress or not. Your biggest value is to lead to better decisions, or quicker decisions, or more informed decisions, or more risk-aware decisions. If you focus on doing that and you learn that actually that elaborate system I drew out on the map is just the way the world is, and if you can use your influencing ability through the way you speak and you write and you respect others' role in the system, because all of these bodies have a legitimate role in the making of public decisions. If you can navigate all of that, you will help both the board and management, the entity, and further beyond to make better decisions. And ultimately, that's your role in life, and that's how making a difference. That's what making a difference really is about. That will draw on lots of hard skills, lots of soft skills, but that's the job of work for me. And the core of that is about empowerment of the management. So how you do oversight, and that's a psychological task, is really, really critical to that. So we could talk about this all day, but for me, that's what making a difference is about on the board.
Thanks, Brendan. And maybe Aoife, do you have any perspectives in terms of those personal attributes that can be brought?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I suppose maybe it was just to pick up on one of Brendan's points about being risk aware, and I suppose and maybe it's to Yasser's query about board decision making. I think there's different appetites to risk for different public bodies. Some can be very cautious in terms and risk averse, so sometimes decisions can take longer to make. But I suppose the one thing I suppose I would sometimes say is not to be afraid of challenge, whether that's in the courts, because challenge, I mean, you may win, you may lose, but a lot of the time it makes good law. And certainly, you know, it's good to get that, you know, that oversight or that view from the courts in terms of procedures and processes and what public bodies can and can't do. And obviously, Brendan referred to the Keating decision earlier, and you know that we do learn from decisions of the courts. So not to necessarily be afraid, but understand at the same time the risk appetite of the public body that you sit on.
Thanks very much, Aoife. And Aidan, same question to you. And I know you referenced the soft skills earlier, so maybe you want to expand on that a bit.
Yeah, and again, briefly, conscious of your time, I think Eva has just touched on a really interesting bit, the risk appetite. Yeah, I think this is the fascinating area in public bodies and state bodies generally, because when we do talk about risk, nobody wants to spend public money recklessly. Yeah, there is a public accountability dimension to it, but you do have to. If we have a level of ambition in a strategy, if we have a level of ambition in what we're trying to go for, there has to be a sense of what's reasonable, yeah, where we're averse, where we're open, where we realize that we're going to invest without security that we're going to get a return. So I think that the derivation, and a lot of my work over the last little while has been even on the risk area, deriving risk appetites for entities, as you'd say, are very conservative. Actually, you know, they're not conservative. So the question about getting to articulate, this is what we're prepared to countenance or not. This is reason and reasonable risk-taking, that risk appetite piece. And I think a good board feeding back into decisions, feeding back into recognizing the importance of the collective, looking at the optimists, pessimists, and realists around the table, and from the optimists, pessimists, and realists to derive a risk appetite statement that the executive understand and can inform decisions. I think it's another fascinating area, and this is where public service and I suppose it's complex. As I think from risk appetite in other environments can be more straightforward. But look, the collective piece, obviously what Brendan and Aoife have said, I would agree completely with that. But I wouldn't underestimate the risk appetite. Even to chat about it, the dialogue is really, really interesting.
Okay, thanks, Aidan. A question that's come in from a few people is looking at maybe the optimum or maximum number of concurrent directorships or roles somebody should hold. I don't know if you have some ideas on that, maybe Brendan?
2, I think, is laid down as the guide and the code. Like, it's hard to do more than 2. There are a number of people who do more than 2, and you open yourself up to a lot of scrutiny. 2 is, if you're blessed with 2, that's enough, I suspect. That's my view.
Thanks, Brendan. I don't know, Aidan or Aoife, do you want to add or just agree?
If you're on 2 state boards, you're probably on other boards as well. So yeah. Time is short.
Thanks very much. We've had lots of questions coming in, but we've been slightly beaten by the clock here. I think this is something we could return to as a much longer event in the future and maybe touch more on some of these questions. Maybe to finish up this part of the event, I was going to maybe just go around the table and ask each of you, to anybody out there who is considering joining a state board, maybe for the first time, is there one top tip you would give them, or is there a particular article or resource that you would refer them to? Maybe Aidan, starting with you on that one.
Yeah, it's okay. Very good. I suppose to do your due diligence is probably your first piece. I do think to recognize and genuinely to recognize that this is a learning and developmental opportunity. Yeah, and to realize that you will develop networks, you will develop expertise and insight and skill. Quick thing to scan. I don't want to be a big lot of work, but the code of practice for state bodies that Brendan had on the slide, has been translated into ETB, the Education Training Board code, and makes its way through all the university codes. Look at the contents page rather than reading the 100 pages that are there. Just have a look at the stuff that's there. And by the way, it borrows a lot on the Financial Reporting Council stuff in the UK Corporate Governance Code as well. It's a lengthy read if you want to have it, but it gives you a flavour about where state boards and similar boards and entities are going. Thanks.
Thanks, Aidan. Aoife, have you some?
Yeah, the code of
tips?
practice. I mean, it's 74 pages, Aidan, and I did read it again before this, and it didn't take me that long. It's quite concisely written, bullet
Yeah.
points, which I love. So that was what I was going to say. And then a shameless plug coming next, which is a presentation that my colleague Catherine Allen, who's a partner in our team, and myself gave earlier on this year, a webinar on governance in the public sector. It's if you Google CPD on demand, governance in the public sector, it's there. It's 1 hour, and you might get you'll get 1 hour of CPD and a certificate for it. So if you don't want to read something, you can watch that.
Absolutely.
I was including the annexes.
You don't need to
The
read
code
that.
is 74, add the annexes to it, and the other bits, it's over 100.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. And maybe we'll give the last word to you, Brendan, on this in terms of a top tip.
Yeah, top tip for me, there's about 2 pages at the start to chapter 1 of the code, which sets out, and it's really worth reflecting on, the role of the board and the need for the board to exercise leadership, oversight, compliance, culture and ethics. Like most of what we do in Navigo is about giving people practical tools and experiential dilemmas and decision making to underline and explain exactly what that means. So the chapter 1 of the code, you don't need to go much further than that if you can actually operationalize it. It's possible to do, but if you sit back and you just become a monarch where the prime minister suits up every so often to visit you and you can be consulted on things and be supportive or just warn occasionally like the old uncle or aunt, you're exposing yourself to a lot of risk. But being active and implementing chapter 1 of the code is your best and most exciting way to fulfill the role. That's it.
Thanks very much. That's great. And so a few tips there, but certainly the code of practice for the governance of state bodies is key, I think, for all of you. That's great. Thanks again to all three of you, Brendan, Aidan, and Aoife, for your time today. It's been great to get your insights and to have the discussion. So appreciate your time on that. Before we finish up the event today, we have publicjobs.ie was mentioned, and that was formerly the Public Appointment Service. So we're joined by Niamh McGuinness, who is a talent acquisitions lead with Public Jobs. The Public Jobs organisation also looks after the State Board's appointments process. So Niamh is going to talk to us a little bit about that applications and appointments process. So you're very welcome, and over to you, Niamh.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon. As you say, my name is Niamh McGuinness, and I manage senior executive recruitment and appointments to state boards in Public Jobs. I'm delighted to be here today to provide a short presentation giving an overview of the state board's process and typical skills required for serving on a state board. So we generally manage about 70 campaigns each year, on average for 200 vacancies. And in 2024, we managed 195 vacancies across 90 campaigns. And of those 90 campaigns, some were to fill single vacancies on a board, some multiple, and some indeed were for new entities where appointments for a complete board were made. On average, we'd receive 11 applications per vacancy. And as you can see there, 77% of appointments, which the majority are from the private sector, and those appointed from the public sector are primarily from the wider public service rather than the civil service, typically the health sector, education, and not-for-profit. We try to send over 3 to 5 names to a minister per vacancy. We also have approximately 9,000 people registered for alerts for state board positions, 45% of whom are female and 55% male. And of those applications received in 2024, 39% of those were from female candidates. However, the number of females appointed has been steadily growing over the last few years, and last year, 58% of appointees were female. So there are over 200 state boards under the aegis of government departments with a wide variety across commercial, non-commercial, voluntary and regulatory sectors. The sectors are wide-ranging and include areas as diverse as arts and heritage, health, environment, transport, and education. So what you can see here on this slide is just some of the campaigns we ran in 2024. If you could move to the next slide, please, Chris. So the process then, each campaign runs through a number of key stages. And at the outset, we take a briefing from the client, which is the government department. And this is key to a successful outcome. We work with the client to refine the specification for each role to ensure the process delivers potential appointees with the appropriate skills. Once the client and ourselves have agreed the role requirements and the campaign information booklet, we advertise on public jobs, and we also use social media, predominantly LinkedIn and X, to promote the opportunities and to reach as wide a pool as possible. We would also issue alerts to those who have registered on an interest in state board appointments on public jobs. Sometimes we use executive search where there's a particular skill requirement for boards, such as forestry or engineering, or where we're simply looking to increase diversity, not just in terms of gender, but in backgrounds as well and their thinking. We'd also use search when it's likely that certain skills may not be widely available here and we need to look and attract candidates from outside of Ireland. Then public jobs will convene an assessment panel to review the applications, which will generally include the chairperson of the board, a client representative, and 2 other nominees for which we seek eminently qualified individuals with the relevant expertise. Then the assessment panel will agree a shortlist of the most suitably qualified candidates, and those names then will be submitted to the Minister for consideration. So in terms of skills, there are a number of key skills required which are common across many boards, such as corporate governance, financial expertise, legal skills, strategic ability, and commercial and business acumen. In this slide, you can see the most prevalent skills from across the range of opportunities we advertised in 2024, which were leadership, finance, governance, and legal, but also innovation and change management. And in addition to these, we also find a huge variety of expertise required that are particular to the board and sector in which each operate. So we will work with our clients to identify opportunities to source potential candidates and ensure the message is reaching the right audience. So what to consider when applying for a state board? We would always say, know your strengths, know the organisation, know the requirements of the role, and ask yourself where you can add value. Do your homework. What boards are of real interest to you? Tailor your CV to the specific requirements of the role or the board. Take time with your letter. It's very important to be clear and concise. And don't presume the board will know you by reputation. Also consider the time commitment, but most importantly, believe in yourself and stay true to yourself. Thank you for your time, and I'm sorry if I rushed through that.
No, thanks very much, Niamh. That's great. Very useful to get that insight into the process as well. Just to clarify as well, there is a dedicated state boards website. Is there state boards?
There is, so it's now on www.publicjobs.ie, and then there's a state boards page on that. All of the opportunities, etc., are there, and you can register your interest to receive alerts for state boards.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thanks very much, Niamh. So if anybody's interested, that's the place to go to get the details of what's available. So I suppose to wrap up from today's event, I just want to thank all our presenters today, to Pamela, to Brendan, Aidan, Aoife, and Niamh. We did rush through that. There was quite a lot in it, and as I said, I think there's probably the makings of a much longer event at some point. But I'd also like to thank the team in Chartered Accountants Ireland, especially Anne Sykes, Chris O'Donoghue, and Neil Fitzgerald, who helped in putting together today's event. I hope all of you enjoyed it and you got some insight into the role and what's required of directors in public sector organisations. I might finish up as well with one shameless plug for the Public Sector Committee. We have our annual Chartered Accountants Ireland Public Sector Conference in October every year. So this year's event will be on the 15th of October. That's a Wednesday and it's a half-day event. So we'll be rolling out some more details about that in the coming months. But if you want to save the date in the meantime, it's the 15th of October. So wrap up for today. Sorry that we didn't get to all the questions as well, but thanks again for all your participation. Take care. Bye.